Josh and Mark and Lee for the job that they do. It is absolutely incredible, and we are very blessed to have you guys. I also want to thank Arla for the job that she did leading the pageant last week. It went great. It was great attendance. Everybody had a very blessed time, and boy, it was fantastic. This morning I want to talk briefly about the idea of shared ministry. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But I want to begin by saying Michelle and I are very proud. This week our daughter passed the test and got her driver's permit. I was going to tell everybody to stay off the sidewalks, but she actually is a great driver. We have lots of confidence in her. We've been practicing with her for a number of months. We started off in the church parking lot, and if some of you saw her driving around the church parking lot, she did a great job. But one day we passed Karen Stromer up, and she said, let me give you some advice about how to do this. She said, take her down to Springdale Cemetery and have her practice down there. For two reasons. One, there's not a lot of traffic, right? And she can practice on those winding roads and get her manual dexterity all developed there. And the other thing is that, down there, even if she makes a mistake, it's not like she's going to kill somebody. So, I'm really excited about having her share the driving duties because I don't like driving as much as she obviously does. There's a lot of moments in life where children begin sharing the responsibilities for not only their lives, but the lives of the family. When children are small, they get to the point where they can finally hold their own bottle. They don't have to have you hold their bottle. And then later on, they get to dress themselves. Sometimes we're not happy that they do that, but when they dress themselves, later on, they read the books to us instead of us reading the books to them. Further on in life, they get their own cell phones, which is a scary prospect, I admit. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they will do the household chores that they are assigned to do. Quality control is not always what it should be. And then later on, they drive on the road. They take your car and drive around, and eventually they live on the road. They don't live in your house anymore. Each step is a step towards independence. I think some of the same steps apply in the church. When they're young, we have graded Sunday school classes. And then later on, we have discipleship class where they prepare to be baptized. And then they get into the church youth group and they interact with kids their age and they talk about youth kinds of things. And then hopefully when they get to be adults, they attend our adult Sunday school. Maybe they become involved in church programs, ministries that they're excited about. And hopefully they will serve in church leadership positions. Now all of that is fine, but we don't usually think of those things, the things that we do, as actual ministry. We think of ministry as what the pastor does. We think of ministry as leading a meaningful worship service, visiting folks who missed church, caring for sick and troubled people, taking care of needy people who show up at this church building and ask for help. If you wanted to be in ministry according to the traditional way of thinking, you have to study. You have to go to school. You have to get a bachelor's degree, then you have to get a master's degree, go through the process of ordination, and then you can do ministry. If you pass all of the rigorous academic training, you can become a professional minister. But I want to challenge that idea this morning. Churches that want to grow, have to see ministry as something that the congregation shares, rather than something that the congregation simply supports. This story that we read this morning of Zechariah and John the Baptist is a great illustration of somebody who allowed God to change his perspective on his traditional understanding of ministry. Now, for those of you who don't know, Zechariah was a priest in Judea, in Jerusalem, at the time of Jesus' birth. Now, the job that priests had, where they would take rotations, and they would go to the temple and they would offer various sacrifices for people. People would bring their sacrifices, whether it was an animal or a grain or sometimes a drink, and they would offer them at the temple. They would burn incense, and they would perform religious rituals from Yom Kippur to Hanukkah, to all those kinds of things that they did at the temple. And sometimes they would advise people on how to follow God's laws, although if you didn't live in Jerusalem, you usually didn't get to talk to the priest about that kind of thing. In the temple in Jerusalem, people were not allowed to do all of those things for themselves. They had to pay the priest. They had to pay the priest to do it. They had to pay the profession to do it. Now, Zechariah became a priest because he was born into the right family. It wasn't like he felt he was called by God and he went to school and became a minister. He was born into the right family, and therefore he was to be a priest. But one day, while he is doing somebody's ritual, offering a sacrifice or something, an angel just appears to him in the temple. He's offering the sacrifice on the altar, and he looks up and there's this angel, and he's absolutely terrified by it. And the angel says the strangest thing to him. He says, Zechariah, your wife is going to have a child. And this child that she's going to have is to be raised in a very godly way, to prepare him for ministry. He's going to be filled with God's Spirit. He's going to grow up, and he is going to preach God's message to his fellow Jews. He's going to teach them that they need to repent of the sins that they're doing. And then he says something really incredible. He compares Zechariah's son to the great prophet Elijah, the greatest prophet in Israel's history. He says Elijah's power and presence would be present in his son's ministry. Now, if you're Zechariah, first of all, you just can't believe that an angel appears to you and says this. But beyond that, Zechariah also knows that his wife has been unable to have a child. They were childless, and on top of the grief of that, now you've got somebody saying that your wife is going to have a baby. And so Zechariah is a little doubtful. He's like, are you serious about this? Because you know the situation, right? And the angel is upset a little bit that Zechariah doesn't believe him. I mean, it's an angel from heaven. How is he going to tell him something that isn't true? So the angel makes him mute, keeps him from being able to speak as kind of a punishment for doubting the message that he brought from God. When Zechariah gets home, he finds out that Elizabeth is pregnant, and she's related to Jesus' mother Mary, who also gets a visit from an angel announcing that she's going to have a miraculous pregnancy. I want you to think about how hard it would be to go through a pregnancy as a husband and be unable to talk to your wife about anything. And think about how hard it would be for Elizabeth to be unable to communicate except for sign language and maybe writing with your husband. I mean, it's an incredible hindrance to be able to do that. But they were able to make it through this time, and eventually Elizabeth has this baby. As was the law, they took him to the temple on the 8th day after his birth, and they dedicated him to God. And there was discussion about what his name was going to be. Usually he's named at the time of dedication. And people thought to themselves, his name's going to be Zechariah. He's going to be named after his father. It's going to be Zechariah Jr. But Zechariah can't say what his name is supposed to be. And usually the fathers name their child. So he's motioning, people trying to figure out what he's doing. And he says he's able to communicate that he needs a piece of paper or something to write with. And so they bring him a piece of paper and he writes down his name is John, just like the angel told him. And as soon as he's able as he writes that, he becomes able to speak again, and his tongue gets loosened up, and all of a sudden he can speak after 9 months of not being able to. And he speaks the words that became this famous hymn for the last 2,000 years in the church. He's inspired by God to speak. And in this hymn, he speaks glowingly about how his son's going to become a prophet, how he would prepare the way for the Messiah that God was sending. He would teach the Jewish people how to participate in their own salvation. And he would guide the people towards godly ways of living. Now, that's quite an expectation for your own son. And as you read the story, you realize that this baby grows up to be the great prophet John the Baptist, who was sent by God to prepare the people for Jesus' coming. God gave Zechariah a new model for thinking about the way that God relates to people and how they should respond to God in their own life. Think about it from Zechariah's perspective. He was a priest. He stood between God and the people. He was the mediator between God and the people. He was responsible for people's relationship with God. He wasn't interested in how God had gifted the people that he served. He didn't care if God had called somebody to some kind of ministry. He was just interested in carrying out the duties of his priesthood. John, on the other hand, is a prophet. John encouraged the people. He encouraged them to get things right with God. He encouraged them to take some responsibility for their spiritual life and for their relationship with God and their own calling. He made people take more responsibility for that than a priest would. John also trained the people that followed him. He taught them, he trained them, and he sent them out into ministry, to do his ministry. And in doing that, John the Baptist started a movement which lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. That shared sense of ministry between the leader and the followers, between the teacher and the disciples, that was a dominant way of looking at ministry, even among Jesus' followers, for hundreds of years. In that model, leaders focused on teaching people to share the ministries of the church. The leaders would teach people how to care for the poor. And they would teach people Jesus' teaching so that they could go out and tell their friends and relatives and convince them to come into church. Church gatherings were this very collaborative meeting. They would share meals and they would fellowship, but there wasn't this tremendous distance between the leadership and the laity. But later on, the church became institutionalized by the Roman Empire. The emperor declared that everybody in the empire was to be Christian, and the priesthood became established as an authority again in the church. If you were a priest during that time, your focus was not on preaching, but on serving communion and administering church rituals. Now, the net effect of that change back to the priesthood was that people again saw the priest as responsible for their relationship with God. People didn't say to themselves, I wonder how God has gifted me for ministry. The priest enabled people to deny responsibility, that they had a responsibility for the growth of the church. The priest alone was responsible. The people didn't have a role in meeting the challenges that arose in the life of the church. That was the priest's job. And when things went bad, the people blamed the priests and the priests blamed the people. Now, part of our tradition as Baptists was to overturn that model and go back to a model where the ministry is shared between pastor and congregation. People began reading the Bible for themselves, and the pastors encouraged them to come to their own set of beliefs about what they read. People started churches that did not answer to the established priesthood. They didn't have to do things the way the bishop told them they had to do it. They didn't have to go through the motions of playing church. Later on, churches reverted to the idea of professional clergy who were trained in universities. Some pastors became professional counselors, some acted as church administrators. But in that movement, churches again lost the sense of shared ministry. People got used to simply paying the professional pastor and then following what he said. That worked for a while, as long as people trusted the church as an institution. Part of the reason why churches have suffered is because that model doesn't work for people anymore. If people have a question about their faith, they don't think they need to go and ask their pastor about it. They can just get on their computers or on their cell phones and Google it, whatever question they have. People don't just want to listen to some leader talk about what their faith experience should be. They don't really trust people in authority. They want to experience the faith for themselves. And that's one of the reasons our church's long-range plan focuses on giving people the opportunity to be very hands-on in ministry. Now, if I were to talk to some of my friends who don't attend church and ask them if they wanted to come to church next Sunday at 10 o'clock, they would probably either laugh at me or say an excuse. But if I were to tell them that we were going to serve meals in a homeless shelter for a couple hours next week, I think many of them would actually be up for it. People outside the church are actually interested in sharing ministry with us. We have to become comfortable with them. There are some real John the Baptist types in this congregation and outside of the church. And we are completely capable, with God's help, of freeing them up for the ministry if we see the ministry as something that we all share. There are two things we need to do in order to help us with that. One, we have to understand that the way God has gifted people in the church to serve God must become more important than the position that somebody holds in the church. One of my primary responsibilities should be to figure out how people are gifted by God and encourage them to do something that uses those gifts, to coach them so they know how to go into ministry. If that's the case, then we may have to start some new ministries, because the ministries that we may have may not cover or use all of the giftedness that God has given us, and God has given us a great deal of giftedness in this church. It's better to have a ministry where people use their gifts rather than to simply stick people in places where we have holes. The second thing is, when we as a church decide that we feel called to do something for some group, we have to include people from the group as we plan. When we do a children's ministry, we need to include the parents and the workers in our planning. If we do a ministry among seniors, we have to have seniors help us plan what that ministry is going to be. If we want to offer a ministry to parents, we have to actually have parents in the group sitting down with us saying, this is when I can be available. I think this is something that I, as a pastor, I'm finally starting to get a handle on, because it's easy for me, it's easy for church leaders to say, well, we're just going to start this ministry and let's go do it. We have to be inclusive and collaborative in order to have a shared ministry. When we started our Hispanic ministries here, we were very successful because we were able to engage local leaders in the Hispanic community. And they got us in contact with people who could actually help us start to do some of the things we wanted to do. There's this picture of me on Facebook probably a year and a half ago, actually speaking with the Mexican ambassador to Illinois about the needs of the Hispanic community. And I didn't arrange that, I just kind of walked into that. But that was because we laid the groundwork, and we were able to be collaborative and had a shared sense of ministry with Hispanic leaders here in Peoria. And that's what we need to do in other areas of our ministry. I believe this congregation is full of people whom God has gifted. There are lots of John the Baptists floating around here, waiting for us to notice, waiting to be coached, waiting to collaborate with people in church leadership in the ministry that God has called this congregation to. When I think of just how capable we are, how much we can do, it gives me new hope. If you feel that you have gifts that maybe haven't been recognized, please let me know. Let the church leadership know. If you have this feeling inside, gnawing away at your conscience, telling you that God has called you to do something special, I want you to know that that's what it feels like. And you need to listen to that. You need to follow it. You need to honor it. So go with it. Tell somebody about it. Let's engage in that ministry together. Let's share that ministry. Because when we do, that is when we will experience new hope. Let us pray.